Picture this. You're complaining about your heating bill while sipping hot coffee in your pajamas, scrolling through Netflix because you're so bored. Meanwhile, 1,000 years ago, Bjorn the Bearded is gnawing on mouldy fish jerky in a smoke-filled hut, listening to his cousin Olaf cough up what might be his actual lung, while outside the wind howls like a banshee with commitment issues. And here's the kicker, Bjorn thinks he's living the good life. Tonight, we're diving into why Viking winters weren't just cold. They were absolutely spectacularly miserable, in ways that would make your worst Monday look like a spa day. If you're ready to feel grateful for central heating and grocery stores, settle in, this journey gets darker before it gets cozy. Let's start with something that'll make you appreciate your thermostat. Imagine living in a world where room temperature meant slightly warmer than a corpse. Viking winter settlements weren't just cold, they were psychological torture chambers wrapped in ice and misery, with a side of dysentery. The average Viking longhouse in winter was basically a wooden coffin for the living. Picture a structure about 100 feet long and 20 feet wide, packed with anywhere from 20 to 50 people, plus their animals. Yes, animals, because nothing says cozy family time like sharing your bedroom with a cow that hasn't been house-trained and 3 goats with digestive issues. The walls were made of wood and turf, essentially dirt held together by hope and the occasional prayer to Thor. These weren't exactly airtight constructions. Cold air seeped through every crack like gossip in a small town. The only source of heat was a central fire pit that produced more smoke than warmth, turning everyone into human bacon, slowly smoked and increasingly desperate. But here's where it gets really charming. There were no chimneys. None. Zero. The smoke just hung around, looking for the occasional gap in the roof to escape through. Most of the time it didn't. So everyone lived in a perpetual haze that would make a 1970s jazz club look well ventilated. Your eyes watered constantly, your throat burned, and you developed what we'd now recognize as chronic bronchitis. The Vikings called it winter cough. We'd call it slow-motion suffocation with a Nordic theme. The floors were usually just packed earth, sometimes covered with rushes or straw that hadn't been changed since the last king died. This created a delightful ecosystem of fleas, lice, and various other creatures that treated human blood like an all-you-can-drink buffet. Walking barefoot meant stepping on things that crunched, squirmed, or both. Privacy was a foreign concept. Not because Vikings were particularly social, but because privacy implied having space, and space implied having enough resources to build more than one room. Families slept side by side on raised platforms called benches, which sounds quaint until you realize these were basically wooden shelves covered with whatever animal fur they could scavenge. The person next to you might be your spouse, your child, your elderly parent with a bladder control problem, or your cousin who talked in his sleep about that time he accidentally killed a monk. The hierarchy even extended to sleeping arrangements. The most important people slept closest to the fire, which meant they got the most warmth but also the most smoke. It was like choosing between hypothermia and lung disease, a lose-lose situation with prestige attached. And let's talk about the sounds. Oh, the sounds. Imagine trying to sleep while listening to a symphony of snoring, coughing, wheezing, animal noises, the wind howling through gaps in the walls, and the occasional scream from someone having a nightmare about being eaten by wolves. Because that was a legitimate concern. Wolves were actually a problem, and the thin walls weren't exactly wolf-proof. The smell was its own special hell. Unwashed bodies, animal waste, rotting food, smoke, and whatever mysterious substances were fermenting in the corners, created an aromatic cocktail that would make a garbage dump seem fragrant. There was no such thing as deodorant, toothpaste, or regular bathing. The concept of fresh air was purely theoretical. Children cried constantly, not from being spoiled, but from being cold, hungry, sick, or all three simultaneously. Their parents couldn't exactly take them for a walk to calm them down, because outside was essentially an Arctic wasteland that could kill you in minutes. So everyone just endured. The crying, the smell, the cold, the smoke, the crowding, all of it. But wait, there's more. The bathroom situation was what we'd now call creative problem solving, and what they called necessary evil. Chamber pots were shared among families, emptied sporadically, and cleaned even less frequently. The outhouse was a wooden structure built over a pit, located just far enough from the main building to require a death-defying sprint through snow and ice, while hoping you didn't encounter any hungry wildlife. Food storage was another adventure in disappointment. Everything was preserved through smoking, salting, or fermentation methods that worked, that produced results that would make modern prison food seem gourmet. Fresh vegetables didn't exist. Fresh fruit was a distant memory. Fresh anything was basically a myth. The psychological impact was devastating. Imagine being trapped in a small, smoke-filled space with dozens of other people for 6 months straight, with no entertainment except storytelling and the occasional argument about whose turn it was to feed the animals. No books, no music beyond what people could remember and sing, no games beyond what could be played with sticks and stones. Seasonal depression wasn't just a clinical term, it was a community-wide affliction. The sun barely rose during the deepest winter months, and when it did, it was weak and ineffective, like a flashlight with dying batteries trying to illuminate a cave. People went literally months without seeing proper sunlight, living in a twilight world of smoke and shadows. Yet, somehow, these people survived. Not just survived, they thrived enough to become legendary raiders and explorers. They endured conditions that would break most modern humans within days, and they did it while maintaining complex social structures, cultural traditions, and enough energy to plan spring raids on their neighbors. The question isn't just how they survived, it's how they maintained their sanity. How do you keep your humanity when you're living like animals? How do you preserve hope when every day is a struggle just to stay alive? Let that sink in as we dive deeper into their world. If you think your grocery budget is tight, wait until you hear about Viking meal planning. Spoiler alert, it involved a lot more gambling with death and significantly fewer organic options. Food in a Viking winter settlement wasn't just scarce, it was a constant source of anxiety that made modern-day food insecurity look like a mild inconvenience. Every meal was essentially a calculated risk, because running out of food meant the difference between seeing spring and becoming a cautionary tale told around next year's fire. The preservation techniques were simultaneously ingenious and horrifying. Take fish, for example, the cornerstone of the Viking winter diet. They didn't just dry it. They created what was essentially fish jerky that could survive a nuclear apocalypse. This involved gutting the fish, covering it in salt, if they had any, and hanging it in the wind until it resembled leather with eyes. The result was nutritious, long-lasting, and had the texture of tree bark soaked in regret. But fish jerky was luxury dining compared to their other options. Fermented fish was where things got really interesting. Vikings would bury fish in sand or wrap it in birch bark and let it rot in a controlled way. The result was something called rackfisk or gravlax, fish that had achieved a level of decay that was technically still edible, but smelled like a crime scene. Modern Scandinavians still eat variations of this, which proves that some traumas run so deep they become cultural traditions. Meat preservation was equally creative. When they slaughtered an animal, usually in late fall, before winter really set in, every single part was used. And I mean everything. Intestines became sausage casings, bones became tools, blood became pudding, and organs became delicacies that only the brave or desperate would consume. Nothing was wasted, because waste meant death. The smoking process was a community affair, mainly because it required constant attention and fuel. Meat was cut into strips and hung over fires for days, slowly dehydrating while absorbing smoke. The end result was protein that could last months, but required the jaw strength of a Viking warrior to actually chew. Children's teeth were often worn down to nubs by adolescents, not from poor dental hygiene, though that was also a problem, but from trying to eat food that fought back. Vegetables were a myth during winter months. The few that could be stored, mainly turnips, onions, and cabbage, were kept in root cellars that were basically holes in the ground covered with stones and prayers. These vegetables had the nutritional value of cardboard and about the same flavor, but they prevented scurvy, which was the difference between having teeth and gumming your food like a frustrated baby. Dairy products existed in a theoretical sense. Cows, goats, and sheep produced milk sporadically during winter, mainly because the animals were as malnourished as everyone else. The milk was usually turned into cheese or butter, and stored in wooden containers that hadn't been properly cleaned since the previous summer. The result was dairy products with personality, specifically the personality of something that had given up on life. Bread was made from whatever grain they'd managed to store, often mixed with bark, sawdust, or other creative ingredients that technically counted as fiber. The grinding was done by hand with stone querns, usually by the women and children, creating flour that contained more grit than actual grain. Eating bread was like chewing sand mixed with hope, and it left everyone's teeth worn down and their digestive systems confused. But here's where Viking ingenuity really shined. And by shined, I mean descended into desperate creativity. When food ran low, which happened regularly, they supplemented their diet with whatever they could find. Tree bark was stripped, ground up, and mixed into bread. Pine needles were brewed into tea for vitamin C. Leather was boiled until it became technically edible. Bone marrow was extracted and consumed like ancient bone broth, except less trendy and more necessary for survival. The hierarchy of food distribution was brutally practical. The strongest warriors ate first and best, because they were the ones who'd be doing the raiding and protecting come spring. Children ate next, but only if there was enough, because they represented the future of the settlement. Women ate after everyone else, which created a cycle of malnutrition that affected everything from pregnancy outcomes to general health. The elderly ate last, if at all, which wasn't cruelty, it was mathematics. Resources were finite, and sentiment was a luxury they couldn't afford. Meal timing was fluid, because there often wasn't enough food for multiple meals. Sometimes there was one meal a day. Sometimes there was one meal every 2 days. Sometimes there was just a handful of fermented fish and a prayer to make it to next week. The concept of 3 square meals was as foreign as central heating. Water was another challenge entirely. Rivers and wells froze solid, so snow had to be melted for drinking water. This required fuel, wood or peat, which was also needed for cooking and heating. Every cup of water represented a choice between hydration and warmth, and dehydration was a constant companion that made everyone's breath smell like a crypt and their skin crack like old leather. The psychological impact of constant hunger was devastating. People became irritable, weak, and prone to fighting over scraps. Families turned against each other when resources dwindled. Children learned early that crying for food was pointless because there simply wasn't any. The social fabric held together through sheer willpower and the knowledge that everyone was suffering equally. Yet somehow, they found ways to make it bearable. Storytelling during meals made the meager portions last longer. Sharing became a survival strategy. Not out of generosity, but because cooperation meant everyone was slightly more likely to survive. They developed rituals around food that transformed eating from mere sustenance into something approaching community. The irony is that these people, surviving on what we'd consider starvation rations, were strong enough to raid monasteries and explore new continents. They were living proof that the human body can adapt to almost anything, and that strength doesn't always come from abundance. Sometimes it comes from learning to thrive with nothing. But food was just one piece of the survival puzzle. The real challenge was staying warm enough to wake up tomorrow. Modern humans think they understand cold. You complain when the office air conditioning is too high, or when you have to scrape ice off your windshield. Let me introduce you to real cold, the kind that doesn't just make you shiver, but makes you question your life choices and contemplate the meaninglessness of existence. Viking winters weren't just cold. They were existentially threatening in ways that would make a polar bear pack up and move somewhere warmer. We're talking about temperatures that regularly dropped to what we'd now consider dangerously unsurvivable, combined with winds that could literally knock you unconscious, and snow that accumulated faster than hope disappeared. The clothing situation was what we'd politely call functional desperation. Vikings wore layers upon layers of whatever they could find, trade for, or strip off their enemies. The base layer was usually linen, if they were lucky enough to have any, followed by wool, followed by more wool, topped with leather or fur, and finished with whatever animal skins they could acquire through hunting, trading, or aggressive negotiation with neighbors. But here's the thing about medieval clothing. None of it was waterproof. Nothing. When snow melted against your body heat, it soaked through every layer, until you were essentially wearing a collection of wet blankets that froze against your skin. The concept of dry became purely theoretical. People lived in a constant state of dampness that would make a basement seem arid. Footwear was particularly tragic. Most people wore leather shoes stuffed with straw or fur, which sounds cozy until you realize that leather becomes rigid as concrete when frozen, and wet straw becomes a breeding ground for whatever medieval equivalent of foot fungus existed. Frostbite was so common it wasn't even considered a medical condition, it was just Tuesday. People regularly lost toes, fingers, and sometimes entire hands or feet to the cold, and they considered themselves lucky if that's all they lost. The fire management was both an art and a science that could mean the difference between life and death. Every piece of wood was precious because trees don't grow much during winter, and cutting down frozen trees with primitive tools was like trying to perform surgery with a butter knife. Fires had to be maintained constantly because letting one die meant starting over, and starting over might not be possible if your fire-starting materials were frozen solid. Fuel sources were creative out of necessity. Wood was ideal, but scarce. Peat was common, but burned slowly, and produced more smoke than heat. Animal dung was plentiful, but required careful drying, and produced a smell that made the already aromatic longhouse even more challenging to inhabit. Bones burned well, but were also needed for tools and food. Every fuel decision was a calculation of immediate warmth versus long-term survival needs. The sleeping arrangements were designed around shared body heat, which sounds romantic until you realize it meant spooning with your extended family, their livestock, and whoever else happened to be sharing your longhouse. Personal space was a luxury no one could afford. The wealthiest might have actual furs to sleep under. Everyone else made do with whatever textiles they could layer together, often sharing bedding that hadn't been washed since the previous spring. But the real enemy wasn't just the cold, it was the wet. Snow would blow through gaps in the walls, melt from body heat, and create puddles that would freeze overnight. Ice formed inside the longhouses, on the walls, around the fire pit, even on people's clothing as they slept. Waking up to find your hair frozen to the wall wasn't unusual. It was Tuesday morning in January. Breathing itself became a challenge. In the deepest cold, each breath felt like inhaling razor blades, and exhaling created clouds of vapor that would freeze and fall to the ground like tiny snow. People developed chronic coughs not just from the smoke, but from constantly breathing air that their lungs weren't designed to process. The phrase bone-deep cold wasn't metaphorical. It described the actual sensation of cold penetrating through layers of fat and muscle until it reached your skeleton and set up permanent residence. The psychological warfare of cold was perhaps worse than the physical discomfort. Cold doesn't just make you uncomfortable, it makes you stupid. Your brain slows down, your decision-making becomes impaired, and your fine motor skills disappear. Simple tasks like tying knots or handling tools became monumentally difficult when your fingers were too numb to feel what they were doing. People made mistakes that in warmer weather would be minor inconveniences, but in winter could be fatal. Children were particularly vulnerable, not just because of their size, but because they couldn't understand why their parents couldn't simply fix the cold. They cried constantly from discomfort, which used up precious energy and created noise that made everyone else's stress levels spike. Parents had to make impossible choices about whether to give children extra clothing or food, knowing that both were limited resources. The elderly suffered in ways that were heartbreaking to witness. Arthritis became debilitating in the cold, making movement painful and difficult. Circulation problems meant extremities went numb for weeks at a time. Many elderly Vikings didn't survive winter, not because they were weak, but because their bodies simply couldn't maintain the energy required to fight the cold for months at a time. Yet somehow, Vikings developed strategies that kept them alive. They learned to recognize the early signs of hypothermia and frostbite. They developed exercises that could be done in confined spaces to maintain circulation. They created games and activities that generated body heat while also providing entertainment. They learned to sleep in positions that maximized shared warmth while minimizing heat loss. The most remarkable thing about Viking cold survival wasn't their technology, it was their mental toughness. They accepted cold as an inevitable part of life and developed a stoic attitude that would make modern motivational speakers weep with envy. They didn't just endure winter, they planned for it, prepared for it, and emerged from it ready to sail across oceans and raid distant lands. But staying warm was only part of the challenge. The real test of Viking winter survival was maintaining sanitation when basic hygiene became nearly impossible. If you think your bathroom situation is rough because the toilet paper is scratchy, buckle up for a journey into Viking hygiene practices that will make you want to kiss your toilet seat and write thank you notes to whoever invented indoor plumbing. Let's start with the most basic human need: using the bathroom. Vikings had what we might generously call flexible standards when it came to waste management. The wealthy longhouses had outhouses, structures built over pits located just far enough from the main building to avoid the worst of the smell, but close enough that you wouldn't die of exposure during the sprint required to reach them. These outhouses were architectural marvels of minimalism, wooden planks over holes, with walls that provided the illusion of privacy. while letting in enough wind to ensure you never spent longer than absolutely necessary. In winter, the toilet seat was essentially a block of ice that would steal your body heat faster than a medieval tax collector. Sitting down was an act of courage that required mental preparation, and possibly a prayer to whatever gods handled bathroom emergencies. But here's where it gets really charming. Toilet paper didn't exist. Instead, Vikings used whatever was available: moss, leaves, when available, corn cobs in later periods, or smooth stones. Yes, stone. Imagine the precision required to use a rock for personal hygiene, without causing injury, that would be difficult to explain to the village healer. The wealthy might have had cloth rags that could be washed and reused, which created an entirely new category of household chores that nobody wanted to volunteer for. The shared nature of these facilities meant that privacy was purely theoretical. Families used the same outhouse, which meant everyone knew everyone else's bathroom schedule, dietary habits, and digestive health status. There were no locks, no lights, and no guarantees that you wouldn't encounter wildlife that had also discovered this warm, sheltered space. Chamber pots were the luxury option: ceramic or wooden bowls kept inside for nighttime emergencies, or when the weather outside was actively trying to kill you. These were shared among family members and emptied irregularly, creating an aromatic situation that added another layer to the already complex scent profile of the longhouse. The person responsible for emptying these was usually whoever had lost the most recent argument, or the youngest family member capable of carrying liquid without spilling it everywhere. Bathing was an event rather than a routine. Vikings didn't bathe regularly, not because they enjoyed being dirty, but because heating enough water for a bath required enormous amounts of fuel and time that were needed for survival activities. When they did bathe, it was usually a communal affair using shared water in wooden tubs that had seen better decades. The same water might be used by multiple people, which meant that being first in the bathing order was a significant privilege. The concept of hot water was miraculous and rare. Water had to be heated over fires in vessels that might or might not be clean, using fuel that was desperately needed for cooking and heating. A hot bath was such a luxury that it was often reserved for special occasions, like preparing for battle, celebrating victories, or trying to cure illnesses that might have been caused by never bathing in the first place. Soap existed in theory but was made from animal fat and ash, creating a substance that was technically cleansing but had the consistency of slime and the smell of a rendering plant. It was harsh enough to remove skin along with dirt, and using it was often more uncomfortable than staying dirty. Most people simply used water, sand, or rough cloth to scrub away the most obvious layers of grime. Hair care was another adventure in creative problem-solving. Vikings were actually quite vain about their hair and beards when they could maintain them. They used combs made from bone or antler to detangle hair that had been exposed to smoke, wind, and whatever mysterious substances were floating around the longhouse. Lice were constant companions, and removing them was a social activity that doubled as entertainment. Families would sit together picking lice from each other's hair, which was both practical pest control and quality family bonding time. Dental hygiene was what we'd now call optimistic improvisation. Vikings used twigs, rough cloth, or their fingernails to clean their teeth. Some used a mixture of salt and herbs when available, but most simply accepted that their teeth would gradually wear down, turn various shades of brown, and eventually fall out. Tooth pain was treated with whatever herbs were available, or simply endured until the tooth either fell out naturally or was removed with tools that were also used for other purposes. The shared living situation meant that personal hygiene affected everyone. One person's poor hygiene became everyone's problem, but addressing it required social skills that balanced honesty with the need to maintain relationships with people you couldn't get away from. There were probably conversations about personal cleanliness that were more diplomatically challenging than international peace negotiations. Women faced additional hygiene challenges related to menstruation and childbirth. Menstrual products consisted of rags that were washed when possible and reused indefinitely, or moss and other natural materials that provided minimal protection and comfort. Childbirth happened in the same smoky, dirty environment where everyone lived, with whatever cleaning materials were available, and midwives who had learned their skills through experience rather than medical training. Laundry was a seasonal activity that required planning and resources. Clothes were washed infrequently, usually in cold water with limited cleaning agents. The process involved beating fabric against rocks or wooden boards, which was effective at removing dirt but also gradually destroyed the clothing. Most people owned very few garments, so washing meant being cold and potentially naked, while waiting for things to dry in conditions that weren't conducive to quick drying. Yet somehow, Vikings managed to maintain enough cleanliness to function as a society. They developed systems and standards that worked within their resource constraints. They understood that cleanliness was connected to health, even if they couldn't always achieve the standards they wanted. They created social norms around hygiene that balanced individual needs with community well-being. The remarkable thing is that despite these conditions, Vikings were healthy enough to be formidable warriors and explorers. They developed immune systems that could handle challenges that would devastate modern humans. Their bodies adapted to conditions that we'd consider uninhabitable, but personal hygiene was just the beginning of their daily struggles. The real challenge was finding ways to occupy their minds during the endless winter months. Picture this. You're trapped in a smoke-filled room with 30 relatives for 6 months straight, with no Netflix, no phones, no books, and no escape. The only entertainment options are whatever your brain can create, or whatever someone else's brain has already created and managed to remember. Welcome to Viking winter entertainment, where boredom wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a genuine threat to mental health and social stability. The primary form of entertainment was storytelling, but this wasn't casual bedtime story reading. This was performance art, with life or death stakes for social cohesion. The designated storytellers, usually the eldest or most charismatic members of the community, were essentially the Netflix algorithm of their time. They had to remember dozens of epic tales, keep track of which stories had been told recently, and somehow make ancient stories feel fresh to people who had heard them dozens of times before. These weren't simple fairy tales either. Viking sagas were complex narratives involving multiple generations of characters, intricate plot lines, political intrigue, supernatural elements, and enough violence to make modern action movies seem tame. The Prose Edda, the Poetic Edda, the Volsunga saga. These were oral traditions that required incredible memory skills to preserve and perform. A single saga could take multiple evenings to tell in its entirety, which was actually perfect because they had multiple evenings and nothing else to do with them. But here's where it gets psychologically interesting. These stories weren't just entertainment, they were cultural programming. They reinforced social values, taught lessons about honor and courage, provided examples of how to handle conflicts, and gave people mental frameworks for understanding their own lives. When your daily reality involves struggling to survive in harsh conditions, hearing stories about heroes who overcame impossible odds becomes more than entertainment. It becomes psychological fuel. The performance aspect was crucial because storytellers had to compete with smoke-irritated eyes, constant coughing, crying children, and the general ambient misery of winter living conditions. They developed theatrical skills that would make modern performers envious. They used different voices for different characters, dramatic gestures, strategic pauses, and whatever props they could improvise. The ability to hold an audience's attention in these conditions was a genuine survival skill. Music was another escape, but the instruments were limited to whatever could be made from available materials. Bone flutes, wooden drums, simple stringed instruments made from gut and wood, nothing that would impress modern musicians, but enough to create rhythm and melody that could transform the atmosphere of the longhouse from desperate survival to communal experience. Singing was particularly important because it required no instruments, could be done by groups, and helped pass time during repetitive tasks like food preparation or textile work. Games were essential for maintaining sanity, but they had to be adapted to the confined space and limited resources. Board games existed. Taflid was a popular strategic game similar to chess, played with carved wooden pieces on boards that could be improvised from flat surfaces and marked lines. Dice games used carved bone pieces and created opportunities for gambling, which added excitement and social dynamics that made the games more engaging. Physical games had to be creative given the space constraints. Arm wrestling, finger games, balance challenges, and contests of strength that could be conducted in small spaces provided entertainment while also serving practical purposes. Maintaining physical fitness during months of relative inactivity was crucial for survival. When spring arrived and more active work resumed, riddles and word games were particularly popular because they required only mental resources, could involve multiple participants, and could be adapted to different skill levels. Viking riddles were often complex puzzles that combined wordplay with cultural knowledge, creating entertainment that was both fun and educational. The ability to create good riddles was a respected skill that could earn social status and appreciation from the community. Crafts served dual purposes as entertainment and practical activity. Carving, textile work, tool-making, and decorative arts provided ways to pass time while creating useful items. People would compete to see who could create the most intricate carvings, the finest stitching, or the most beautiful decorative elements. These activities also preserved and passed on technical skills that were essential for the community's long-term survival. Gambling was a serious form of entertainment that added stakes and excitement to otherwise simple activities. Vikings would bet on everything: dice games, contests of strength, riddles, even predictions about whether or when certain people would wake up. The stakes were usually small personal items, food portions, or promises of future favors, but the psychological impact of having something to win or lose made routine activities feel more meaningful. Children's entertainment was particularly challenging because children had shorter attention spans and fewer resources for self-entertainment. Adults had to create games that would keep children occupied without driving everyone else insane. Simple physical games, storytelling adapted for younger audiences, and creative play with whatever materials were available became community responsibilities rather than just parental duties. The social dynamics of entertainment were complex because the same people were both audience and performers for months at a time. Everyone had to take turns being entertaining, which meant developing skills in storytelling, music, games, or humor. The ability to contribute to group entertainment became a valuable social skill that affected your standing in the community. But perhaps the most important aspect of Viking winter entertainment was its psychological function. These activities weren't just ways to pass time, they were methods of maintaining hope, preserving culture, strengthening social bonds, and creating meaning in circumstances that could easily have led to despair. The entertainment served as a reminder that humans could create beauty, humor, and joy even in the most challenging circumstances. The irony is that despite having access to virtually unlimited entertainment options, modern humans often struggle with boredom in ways that Vikings never did. They understood that entertainment was a necessity, not a luxury, and they invested in it accordingly. They created rich cultural traditions around storytelling, music, and games that sustained them through months of hardship. But entertainment was just one way Vikings coped with winter. The real test of their resilience was how they handled the constant threat of death that lurked around every corner. Let's talk about something modern humans rarely contemplate: living in a world where death isn't an abstract concept that happens to other people, but a constant presence that could claim you for reasons as trivial as stepping outside without proper preparation or eating something that looked fine but had turned lethal overnight. Viking winter settlements existed in a state of perpetual precariousness that would give modern safety inspectors permanent anxiety disorders. Every single day involved dozens of decisions that could mean the difference between seeing another sunrise or becoming a cautionary tale told around next winter's fire, and the margin for error was essentially non-existent. Fire was simultaneously their greatest ally and their most dangerous enemy. The central fire pit that kept everyone alive could also kill everyone if managed incorrectly. Sparks could ignite dried rushes on the floor, turning the entire longhouse into a wooden crematorium within minutes. The smoke that provided warmth could also suffocate sleeping families if ventilation was inadequate. Carbon monoxide poisoning was a regular occurrence that they didn't understand scientifically, but recognized practically. People would simply fail to wake up after particularly smoky nights. Fire management required constant vigilance from multiple people. Someone had to tend the fire throughout the night, adding fuel without creating dangerous flare-ups, ensuring adequate ventilation without letting too much heat escape, and watching for signs that the fire was spreading beyond its containment. Falling asleep on fire duty could literally kill everyone you loved, which created a level of responsibility that would break most modern humans. The structural integrity of longhouses was another constant threat. These buildings were constructed from materials that expanded and contracted with temperature changes, creating stress points that could fail catastrophically. Heavy snow loads could cause roof collapse, trapping and crushing everyone inside. Windstorms could tear away sections of walls, exposing everyone to lethal temperatures within minutes. The buildings creaked and groaned constantly, creating a soundtrack of structural uncertainty that reminded everyone how fragile their shelter really was. Food poisoning was a regular Russian roulette that everyone played multiple times daily. Without refrigeration or reliable preservation methods, determining whether food was safe to eat required skills that were part science, part art, and part desperate gambling. Fermented foods could cross the line from preserved to toxic without obvious warning signs, Meat could appear fine on the outside while harboring bacteria that would cause agonizing death within days. Even water could be contaminated with parasites or bacteria that turned basic hydration into a life-threatening activity. The symptoms of food poisoning in winter were particularly dangerous because dehydration and weakness made people vulnerable to hypothermia and other cold-related deaths. Someone who became ill from bad food might not have the energy reserves needed to maintain body temperature, creating a cascading failure that could be fatal even if the original poisoning wasn't severe. Families had to make horrifying decisions about whether to share limited clean food with sick members who might not survive anyway. Medical emergencies were death sentences disguised as temporary setbacks. A simple cut could become infected, leading to blood poisoning that killed healthy adults within days. Broken bones couldn't be properly set, creating permanent disabilities that affected survival capabilities. Childbirth was a gamble with odds that would make Vegas bookmakers nervous. Maternal and infant mortality rates were astronomical by modern standards, and complications that would be minor inconveniences today were often fatal. The complete absence of modern emergency services meant that every medical crisis had to be handled with whatever knowledge and resources were immediately available. The community's designated healer might be skilled and experienced, or they might be someone who had simply volunteered for the job because nobody else wanted it. Medical treatments ranged from genuinely helpful herbal remedies to complete superstition, and there was no reliable way to distinguish between them until after trying them on someone who might die regardless. Weather emergencies could kill entire settlements if conditions aligned poorly. Blizzards could last for days, making it impossible to leave shelters even for essential tasks like feeding animals or gathering firewood. If food stores ran low during extended storms, people faced the choice between starving or risking death by exposure in attempts to find additional resources. Some winters, entire communities simply disappeared, leaving empty longhouses that told silent stories of miscalculation and misfortune. The psychological pressure of constant mortal danger created mental health challenges that had their own deadly consequences. Despair could lead to fatal mistakes, poor judgment, neglect of essential tasks, or deliberate self-harm. Paranoia, anxiety could destroy social cohesion, leading to conflicts that divided communities when unity was essential for survival. The stress of watching friends and family die from preventable causes created trauma that affected decision-making abilities. Children were particularly vulnerable because they lacked the experience and judgment needed to navigate constant danger. They could accidentally cause fires, consume dangerous substances, or venture outside inappropriately dressed, creating emergencies that threatened not just themselves but anyone who tried to rescue them. Parents lived with the constant awareness that their children's natural curiosity and inability to understand consequences could lead to tragedy at any moment. The elderly faced different but equally serious threats. Their reduced mobility made them vulnerable in emergencies. Their weakened immune systems made them susceptible to illnesses that younger people might survive. And their accumulated health problems created cascading failures when stress increased. Many elderly Vikings didn't expect to survive winter, and this awareness affected family dynamics and resource allocation in ways that would seem heartless to modern sensibilities, but were simply practical necessity. Yet, despite these constant threats, Vikings developed remarkable systems for managing risk and responding to emergencies. They created redundancies in essential systems, cross-trained multiple people in critical skills, and developed protocols for common emergencies. They understood probability and resource allocation in ways that allowed them to maximize survival chances even when perfect safety was impossible. The community response to death was both pragmatic and emotionally sophisticated. They mourned their losses, but couldn't afford to let grief compromise their survival efforts. They learned from each death, adjusting their practices and protocols to prevent similar tragedies. They developed rituals and customs that helped process trauma, while maintaining the psychological resilience needed to continue facing daily dangers. But perhaps most remarkably, they maintained enough hope and determination to not just survive, but to plan for futures beyond mere survival. They continued having children, making long-term plans, and preserving cultural traditions that looked beyond immediate threats to possibilities that lay beyond winter. The question that haunted every Viking settlement was whether their preparations would be enough to carry them through to spring. There's something uniquely terrifying about living in a world where survival depends on correctly estimating how much longer hell will last. Vikings didn't have calendars in the modern sense, weather forecasts, or any reliable way to predict when winter would end. They lived in a constant state of mathematical anxiety, constantly calculating whether their dwindling resources would outlast the endless cold. Food storage calculations were the difference between life and death, but they required predicting the unpredictable. How long would this winter last? Would it be a mild winter that ended early, allowing for spring foraging, or a harsh one that extended well into what should have been growing season? How much food could they afford to eat each day, while still maintaining a safety margin for unexpected delays? These weren't theoretical problems. They were daily decisions made with incomplete information and fatal consequences for miscalculation. The rationing systems were brutal exercises in human psychology and mathematics. Families had to balance immediate hunger against future starvation, knowing that eating too much today might mean dying next month, but eating too little today might mean lacking the strength needed for essential survival tasks. Children didn't understand why they couldn't have more food when they were clearly hungry, creating emotional stress that compounded the practical challenges. Community leaders had to make decisions that would affect everyone's survival chances, often without consensus and always without certainty. Should they slaughter another animal early to prevent it from starving, knowing this would provide immediate food but reduce long-term resources? Should they share resources with neighboring settlements that were struggling, risking their own survival for community relationships that might prove valuable later? Should they begin strict rationing early to extend food supplies or maintain normal consumption as long as possible to preserve morale and strength? The fuel situation was equally precarious. Firewood consumption had to be balanced against the need to maintain life-sustaining heat, but gathering additional fuel required venturing outside in dangerous conditions and expending energy that weakened people in other ways. They developed sophisticated systems for maximizing fuel efficiency, banking fires to preserve coals, using specific burning techniques to extract maximum heat from limited wood, and carefully managing airflow to balance heat production with smoke management. Social tensions increased exponentially as resources dwindled and stress accumulated. People who had cooperated successfully during autumn preparations found themselves in conflicts over resource allocation, work distribution, and decision-making authority. The confined living conditions meant that interpersonal conflicts couldn't be resolved through separation or cooling-off periods. Arguments that might have been minor disagreements in other circumstances could escalate into community-threatening divisions when everyone was hungry, cold, and afraid. The psychological burden of uncertainty was perhaps worse than actual hardship. Humans can endure almost anything if they know it will end, but uncertainty about duration creates a special kind of mental torture. Vikings lived with the constant knowledge that their supplies might run out before spring, that next week might be when starvation began, that today might be the last day they felt genuinely warm. Weather reading became a community obsession involving everyone who had accumulated knowledge about seasonal patterns. Elders shared memories of previous winters, trying to identify patterns that might predict current conditions. People watched for signs in animal behavior, wind patterns, ice formation, and any other indicators that might suggest whether winter was progressing normally or extending beyond typical duration. But these predictions were often wrong, and wrong predictions could lead to resource allocation decisions that proved fatal. The countdown mentality affected every aspect of daily life. People began hoarding personal items, saving their best clothing for later in winter when their current garments might be completely worn out. They rationed soap and other cleaning supplies, accepting increasing filth as a reasonable trade-off for having resources available when conditions became even more desperate. They saved their most entertaining stories and games for the deepest part of winter when morale would be most critical. Physical deterioration became a visible countdown marker that nobody wanted to acknowledge. Everyone was getting thinner, weaker, and sicker as winter progressed. Children's growth slowed or stopped entirely. Adults lost muscle mass and developed the hollow-eyed appearance of chronic malnutrition. Elderly family members became increasingly frail, and everyone understood that some people who had entered winter healthy might not survive to see spring, regardless of resource management. The planning for spring activities took on desperate importance. As both motivation and practical necessity, families discussed their plans for spring planting, summer raiding, trading expeditions, and other activities that assumed survival through winter. These conversations served as psychological anchors that provided hope and purpose, but they also required practical preparation that competed with immediate survival needs for time and energy. Equipment maintenance became critical as winter progressed, because tools and clothing that failed near the end of winter couldn't be replaced until spring trade opportunities became available. People spent increasing amounts of time repairing and maintaining items that were wearing out, using precious fuel for light to work by, and valuable materials for repairs. But neglecting maintenance could mean facing spring without essential tools needed for farming, building, other renewal activities. The community had to balance individual family needs against collective survival, making decisions about resource sharing that affected everyone's chances. Families that had prepared better faced pressure to share with those who had prepared poorly, but excessive sharing could compromise everyone's survival. Communities that were too generous might all die together, while those that were too selfish might survive winter, only to face spring without enough people to rebuild effectively. Health monitoring became a constant community activity as people watched for signs of serious illness that could affect group survival chances. Decisions about caring for sick people had to balance compassion against resource allocation. Caring for someone who was unlikely to recover commoded resources that might make the difference between survival and death for healthy family members. The remarkable thing about this constant countdown anxiety was that it didn't destroy Viking communities. It strengthened them. Facing shared uncertainty created bonds and cooperation mechanisms that carried over into other aspects of life. People learned to make difficult decisions under pressure, to cooperate when individual interests conflicted with group needs, and to maintain hope even when circumstances seemed hopeless. But even the most careful planning and strongest community bonds couldn't eliminate the role of pure luck in winter survival. Sometimes, despite perfect preparation and ideal cooperation, winter simply lasted too long, or conditions became too harsh for human endurance. The difference between communities that survived and those that disappeared often came down to factors beyond human control. You know what's humbling? Realizing that all your careful planning, resource management, and community cooperation can be completely negated by weather that simply decides it doesn't want to follow normal patterns. Vikings learned this lesson repeatedly and harshly, in ways that would make modern meteorologists grateful for their heated offices and accurate forecasting technology. The concept of a normal winter was purely theoretical because winter weather operated according to its own mysterious logic that had nothing to do with human needs or expectations. Some winters were mild enough that people could venture outside regularly, gather additional firewood, and even hunt small game to supplement their food stores. These were the winters that created false confidence and led to inadequate preparation for the years when Mother Nature decided to show off her more creative destruction skills. Then there were the winters that meteorologists would now classify as extreme weather events, but Vikings simply called the winter when the Johansons disappeared, or the year the livestock froze, standing up. These were winters that lasted weeks or months longer than anyone had experienced before, with temperatures that made normal cold seem tropical, and snowfall that accumulated faster than it could melt, even during brief warm spells. Blizzards weren't just inconvenient weather, they were siege warfare conducted by nature itself. A serious blizzard could trap people in their longhouses for weeks at a time, making it impossible to feed animals, gather firewood, or even step outside for essential sanitation needs. The wind didn't just blow snow around, it created whiteout conditions that could disorient someone within feet of their own door, causing them to wander in circles until they froze to death within sight of safety. The psychological impact of being trapped by weather was devastating in ways that modern humans, with their weather apps and heated homes, can barely comprehend. Imagine knowing that your animals are dying of starvation in their shelters, but being unable to help them because stepping outside would mean your own death. Imagine hearing the wind tear pieces off your roof, while knowing that you can't make repairs until the storm ends, but having no idea when that might be. Ice storms created their own category of misery that combined multiple threats into single catastrophic events. Freezing rain would coat everything in inches of ice, making movement impossible, and adding structural loads that could collapse buildings. The weight of ice could bring down trees that had provided windbreaks, exposing settlements to harsher conditions just when they were least able to cope with additional stress. Ice-coated surfaces meant that even simple tasks like walking from one building to another became potentially fatal activities. The variability of winter weather made long-term planning a gambling exercise with death as the stakes. A winter that started mildly might suddenly turn severe, catching people who had based their rationing calculations on optimistic assumptions. Conversely, a harsh early winter might exhaust fuel and food reserves, leaving communities vulnerable if conditions didn't improve as expected. There was no way to know which approach would prove correct until it was too late to change strategies. Temperature fluctuations created their own unique challenges that went beyond simple cold. Rapid freeze-thaw cycles could turn stored food supplies into rotting mush, destroy stored materials, and create structural damage that compromised shelter integrity. A brief warm spell might seem like good news until people realized it had melted their ice-preserved food stores or created flooding that contaminated their water supplies. Wind was an enemy that never slept and never showed mercy. Constant wind stripped away body heat faster than fires could replace it, created psychological stress through endless noise, and carried away precious heat from buildings through gaps that seemed insignificant in calm conditions. The wind also carried snow into places it had no business being, creating drifts that could bury entire buildings and ice formations that could collapse shelters. Some winters brought combinations of conditions that created perfect storms of misery. Extended cold periods followed by sudden warming could create flooding that contaminated food stores and destroyed essential equipment. Severe windstorms during the coldest parts of winter could scatter stored firewood, damage buildings, and kill livestock that provided essential resources. These combination disasters required communities to adapt to multiple simultaneous crises while operating with depleted resources and weakened people. The unpredictability of weather made every decision a calculated risk with potentially fatal consequences. Should families burn extra fuel during a cold snap, risking running out later if winter extended longer than expected? Should they consume more food during harsh periods to maintain strength, potentially facing starvation if conditions didn't improve? Should they attempt dangerous trips outside during brief lulls in bad weather, risking death for the chance to gather additional resources? Wildlife behavior during extreme winters added another layer of unpredictability to an already chaotic situation. Desperate animals would venture closer to human settlements, creating opportunities for additional food, but also dangers from predators that were as hungry and desperate as the humans. Wolves, bears, and other large predators faced the same resource scarcity as humans, and were willing to take greater risks to find food, including investigating human settlements that normally would have been avoided. The community response to weather emergencies revealed both the best and worst of human nature under extreme stress. Some communities pulled together, sharing resources and supporting vulnerable members even when doing so reduced everyone's survival chances. Others fractured under pressure, with families hoarding resources and abandoning community cooperation when individual survival was at stake. The weather didn't just test physical endurance, it tested the social bonds that held communities together. Record-keeping, such as it was, focused heavily on weather patterns. Because understanding previous winters was essential for survival planning, communities maintained oral histories of severe winters, noting their duration, intensity, and the strategies that had proved successful or fatal. This knowledge was passed down through generations as practical wisdom that could mean the difference between preparation and disaster. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Viking winter weather survival was the acceptance of uncertainty. They understood that perfect preparation could still result in death if weather conditions exceeded human capacity for adaptation. They planned as carefully as possible while accepting that factors beyond their control would ultimately determine their fate. This philosophical approach to uncontrollable circumstances shaped Viking culture in ways that extended far beyond winter survival. It created a worldview that balanced practical preparation with acceptance of fate, individual responsibility with recognition of forces beyond human influence. Yet for all the challenges weather created, it wasn't the only threat that could destroy a winter settlement. Here's something that might surprise you. While Vikings spent most of their energy fighting against nature, cold and starvation, their greatest winter threat often came from other humans. Because apparently, when resources are scarce and survival is uncertain, some people respond by becoming cooperative and resilient, while others respond by deciding that taking what they need from their neighbors sounds like a reasonable plan. Raiding didn't stop during winter. It just changed form and became more desperate. While the stereotypical image of Vikings involves longships and summer raids on distant monasteries, winter raiding was a different beast entirely. These were short-range attacks on neighboring settlements, usually motivated not by adventure or glory, but by the mathematical reality that your family would starve to death unless you acquired additional resources immediately. Winter raids were particularly brutal because they targeted communities that were already vulnerable and struggling. Attackers knew that their victims would be weakened by cold and malnutrition, confined to predictable locations, and unable to flee effectively in harsh weather conditions. A successful winter raid could provide enough food, fuel, and other resources to ensure survival, while also eliminating potential competitors for spring resources in the same region. The psychological warfare was as important as the physical violence. The mere threat of winter raids created constant anxiety that affected every aspect of community life. Settlements had to balance the need for security against the reality that defensive preparations consumed resources that were desperately needed for survival. Guards had to be posted and rotated, requiring people to spend time and energy on vigilance instead of essential winter tasks. Defense during winter was a nightmare scenario that required impossible choices. Fighting in winter conditions meant that both attackers and defenders were operating at severely reduced capacity due to cold, malnutrition, and difficult movement conditions. Weapons could freeze and become unreliable, heavy clothing restricted mobility, and the need to maintain body temperature competed with the need for combat effectiveness. The timing of winter attacks was strategically planned around victims' vulnerabilities. Raids often occurred during the coldest parts of winter when people were least likely to venture outside, most dependent on stored resources, and weakest from months of privation. Attackers would wait for severe weather conditions that would prevent escape or pursuit, essentially using the weather as an ally that trapped their victims and covered their approach. Community betrayal was another human threat that was perhaps worse than external attacks. When resources became critically scarce, some community members would make private arrangements with potential attackers, providing information about food stores, defensive capabilities, and optimal timing in exchange for promises of better treatment during raids. These internal betrayals could destroy communities more effectively than any external attack. The social dynamics of deciding who to raid created complex moral calculations that revealed the harsh pragmatism of survival ethics. Communities had to choose targets based on factors like defensive capabilities, resource storage, family relationships, and previous alliances. Raiding close neighbors meant destroying relationships that might be valuable in future years, but distant targets required longer journeys that increased risks and reduced success chances. Refugee situations created additional human threats, as failed communities sent survivors seeking shelter with more successful settlements. These refugees might be genuinely desperate people seeking humanitarian assistance, or they might be advanced scouts for raiding groups, or they might simply be additional mouths to feed when resources were already stretched beyond safe limits. Communities had to make life or death decisions about whether to provide assistance to strangers. The resource calculation for helping refugees was brutal but unavoidable. Taking in additional people during winter meant reducing everyone's survival chances. But turning away refugees could mean condemning them to certain death while also potentially creating enemies who might return with reinforcements. Some communities developed systems for temporary assistance that helped refugees survive until they could move on, while others simply refused all assistance to preserve their own survival margins. Internal community conflicts intensified during winter stress and could escalate into violence that threatened everyone's survival. Disputes over resource allocation, leadership decisions, or personal grievances that might have been manageable during summer became existential threats when the community needed maximum cooperation. Sometimes conflicts resulted in community splits that left both books too small and under-resourced to survive effectively. The leadership challenges during winter created opportunities for power struggles that could destroy communities from within. Decisions about rationing, defense, resource sharing, and emergency responses required authority and consensus, but the stress of survival made people less willing to accept leadership they disagreed with. Leadership disputes could paralyze decision-making when quick responses were essential, or create rival factions that competed for resources instead of cooperating for survival. Women's safety became a particular concern during winter conflicts because they were often targeted specifically during raids for their value as captives. Their knowledge of food storage and preparation, and their role in maintaining household operations. The confined living conditions of winter settlements made it impossible to hide or protect vulnerable community members effectively, creating additional anxiety for families trying to maintain normal social functions while preparing for potential violence. Children were both protected assets and dangerous liabilities during winter conflicts. They needed protection but couldn't contribute to defense. They consumed resources but couldn't help acquire more. And their presence created emotional vulnerabilities that could be exploited by attackers or could compromise defensive decision-making. Parents had to balance child safety against community needs in ways that created impossible moral calculations. The aftermath of winter conflicts often determined whether communities could rebuild effectively come spring. Raids that killed or captured essential community members, skilled craftsmen, experienced leaders, or people with specialized knowledge could cripple a settlement's long-term viability, even if immediate survival was achieved. The loss of breeding livestock, seed stores, or essential tools during raids could prevent effective recovery even after winter ended. Alliance systems provided some protection against winter raids, but also created obligations that could be difficult to fulfill during resource scarcity. Communities that had agreed to mutual defense pacts during abundant times faced difficult decisions about whether to honor those commitments when doing so might compromise their own survival. The balance between cooperation and self-preservation created complex political calculations that affected regional stability. Yet, despite these human threats, many Viking communities developed sophisticated systems for maintaining security while preserving resources for survival needs. They created early warning networks, established protocols for emergency cooperation, and maintained diplomatic relationships that reduced the likelihood of conflicts during the most vulnerable times. The remarkable thing about Viking winter survival wasn't just their ability to endure harsh natural conditions, but their success in maintaining social structures and cooperative relationships. Despite the enormous pressures that push communities toward conflict and dissolution, but even communities that successfully managed both natural and human threats faced one final challenge that could undo all their careful preparation. There comes a moment in every Viking winter settlement when careful planning meets brutal reality, and the question stops being, how do we thrive, and becomes, who among us will see spring? This wasn't dramatic storytelling. It was mathematical certainty that communities faced with the emotional weight of knowing that not everyone would survive, regardless of how much they loved each other or how hard they tried. The tipping point usually arrived quietly, without fanfare or obvious markers. It might be the morning when someone realized the food stores were half empty, but winter was only half over. It might be the day when the weakest family member stopped getting up, not from illness but from the simple exhaustion of fitting to survive every single day. It might be the moment when people stopped talking about spring plans and started making peace with the possibility that there might not be a spring for them. Resource allocation decisions became exercises in playing God with people you loved. Families had to decide whether to give the last bit of extra food to the sick child who might recover, or the healthy adult who was more likely to survive and could work to help the family continue. Communities had to choose between supporting elderly members who had contributed for decades but were now liabilities, or focusing resources on younger people who might live to rebuild if the settlement survived. These weren't abstract ethical discussions. They were daily decisions made by people who were starving, exhausted, and watching their loved ones slowly die. The guilt of making these choices was almost as destructive as the physical hardships. Parents had to watch their children go hungry while calculating whether feeding them more would help them survive, or just prolong their suffering. Community leaders had to deny help to families they'd known for years, knowing that their decisions would determine who lived and who died. The psychological deterioration was as dangerous as physical starvation. People who had been strong leaders became paralyzed by decision-making anxiety. Individuals who had been cooperative community members became hostile and suspicious. Children stopped playing and developed the hollow-eyed seriousness of adults who had seen too much death. The community bonds that were essential for survival began fraying just when they were needed most. Sleep became an escape that people craved but couldn't achieve. Hunger creates insomnia, cold makes comfortable rest impossible, and anxiety about tomorrow prevents the mental relaxation needed for restorative sleep. People lived in a constant state of exhaustion that made good decision-making nearly impossible, creating a cycle where poor choices led to worse conditions that made even poorer choices more likely. The social hierarchy, that had provided structure during better times, became a source of resentment and conflict when resources became critically scarce. People who had accepted their lower status when everyone had enough to eat became angry when they watched higher status families receive larger food portions. The customs and traditions that had maintained order began to feel like unfair privileges when following them meant some people would die while others lived. Mental illness, as much as Vikings understood it, became prevalent in ways that threatened community survival. What we'd now recognize as severe depression, anxiety disorders, and post-traumatic stress manifested as people who stopped contributing to essential tasks, became violent or unpredictable, or simply gave up and waited to die. communities had to decide whether to continue supporting people who couldn't or wouldn't help with survival efforts. The death watch became a regular part of community life as people who were obviously failing were cared for during their final days. These deaths served as both warnings and motivations, warnings about what happened when you didn't fight hard enough to survive, and motivations to keep struggling even when everything seemed hopeless. The process of dying was usually slow and visible, which meant everyone lived with constant reminders of their own potential fate. Children's deaths were particularly devastating because they represented not just immediate loss, but the destruction of future hope. A community could survive losing elderly members or even adults, but losing children meant losing the next generation that would rebuild and continue the settlement. Parents who lost children often lost the motivation to continue their own survival efforts, creating cascading losses that could destroy entire family units. The decision about when to give up became a community discussion that no one wanted to have, but everyone thought about. Should they continue rationing strictly and hope for early spring, risking slow starvation for everyone? Should they consume remaining resources more freely and enjoy a few weeks of adequate food before facing the inevitable? Should they attempt desperate measures like dangerous foraging, expeditions, or raids on other settlements? Some communities made collective decisions to send their strongest members on final desperate missions. Attempts to reach other settlements for help, dangerous hunting expeditions in harsh weather, or raids on better supplied neighbors. These missions usually failed and resulted in additional deaths, but they represented hope and action when passive waiting for spring seemed like choosing slow suicide. The religious and spiritual responses to approaching doom varied widely, but usually intensified as conditions worsened. Some people turned to prayer and ritual sacrifices, hoping to appease gods who might intervene to save them. Others abandoned religious practices entirely, deciding that gods who would allow such suffering weren't worth worshipping. These spiritual conflicts added another layer of community tension when unity was desperately needed. Yet even at the breaking point, some communities discovered reserves of strength and cooperation that surprised everyone. People who had seemed weak or selfish revealed unexpected courage and generosity. Families that had been feuding put aside their differences to work together for survival. Individuals made sacrifices that increased others' survival chances even when it meant reducing their own. The randomness of who survived and who died at the breaking point often had little to do with preparation, strength, or moral character. Sometimes the people who had been most generous and helpful were the first to die, while those who had been selfish and difficult managed to survive. This randomness created survivor guilt and philosophical questions about justice and fairness that affected communities for generations. But for those who did manage to hold on past the breaking point, there was always the question of whether survival would be worth the cost they had paid to achieve it. The compromises, betrayals, and losses that enabled survival created trauma that would shape the rest of their lives. The real test wasn't just surviving winter. It was surviving it with enough of your humanity intact to build something worth living for when spring finally arrived. Picture this. You've just survived the most brutal winter of your life, but instead of feeling victorious, you're haunted by every decision you made, every person you couldn't save, and every moral compromise that kept you alive. Viking winter survivors didn't just carry physical scars. They carried psychological wounds that would define how they approached life, death, and human relationships for the rest of their existence. The guilt was perhaps the heaviest burden survivors carried into spring. Every morsel of food they had consumed while others starved became a weight on their conscience. Every warm spot by the fire they had claimed while family members shivered became a source of shame. Every decision to preserve their own strength instead of helping someone weaker became a choice they would replay endlessly in quieter moments. Survivor guilt wasn't just an emotional luxury, it was a practical problem that affected their ability to function and rebuild. The relationships that survived winter were fundamentally changed by the experiences they had shared. People who had watched each other make desperate choices under extreme pressure could never again pretend those choices hadn't revealed something essential about character. Friendships were either strengthened by shared suffering or destroyed by witnessed betrayals. Families were bound more closely together by what they had endured, or fractured permanently by resentments over resource allocation and survival decisions. Children who survived brutal winters emerged as fundamentally different people than they would have become in easier circumstances. They had watched adults make life and death decisions, seen family members die from preventable causes, and learned that safety was an illusion and comfort was temporary. These children grew up with an understanding of mortality and resource scarcity that shaped their entire worldview, making them both more resilient and more cautious than children who had never faced genuine survival threats. The community's social structure was often permanently altered by winter experiences. Leadership hierarchies that had seemed natural and appropriate during prosperous times were challenged by memories of who had made good decisions under pressure and who had failed when leadership mattered most. People who had shown courage and wisdom during the darkest times found their social status elevated, while those who had proved unreliable or selfish found themselves marginalized regardless of their previous standing. The physical recovery process was more complex than simply returning to normal health. Months of malnutrition, exposure to cold, and chronic stress had created health problems that would affect survivors for years or permanently. Joints damaged by cold and damp conditions would ache for life. Digestive systems compromised by poor food quality would never fully recover. Respiratory problems caused by smoke and cold air would worsen with age. The winter had quite literally aged everyone who survived it. Memory became both treasure and torment for winter survivors. The stories of survival became part of their identity and their community's history, but remembering also meant reliving trauma. Veterans of particularly harsh winters would find themselves triggered by certain smells, sounds, or weather conditions that reminded them of their worst moments. The approach of each new winter brought not just practical concerns, but psychological dread based on visceral memories of previous suffering. The relationship with material possessions changed permanently for people who had survived severe resource scarcity. Food was never again taken for granted. Survivors often hoarded provisions compulsively, even during abundant times, because they had learned that plenty could become scarcity without warning. Warmth, shelter, and safety became precious commodities that were appreciated with an intensity that people who had never faced their absence could never understand. Religious and philosophical worldviews were often fundamentally altered by winter survival experiences. Some survivors became more devout, convinced that divine intervention had saved them, and grateful for protection they believed had been provided by gods. Others lost faith entirely, unable to reconcile belief in benevolent deities with memories of watching innocent people suffer and die despite prayers and offerings. Many developed a fatalistic acceptance that combined practical preparation with acknowledgement that factors beyond human control ultimately determined survival. The approach to risk and safety changed dramatically for winter survivors. People who had lived through genuine life or death situations developed finely calibrated risk assessment skills that made them excellent at identifying and preparing for potential dangers, but they also sometimes became paralyzed by anxiety about situations that reminded them of previous vulnerabilities. The balance between appropriate caution and paranoid fear was difficult to maintain. Interpersonal relationships were affected by changes in empathy and emotional availability. Survivors who had been forced to make hard choices about resource allocation sometimes developed emotional callousness as a protective mechanism. Others became hyper-empathetic, unable to enjoy their own comfort when they knew others were suffering. The emotional regulation skills needed for survival sometimes proved maladaptive when applied to peacetime relationships. The storytelling traditions of Viking culture were enriched but also darkened by winter survival experiences. The stories that emerged from brutal winters became cautionary tales that helped future generations prepare more effectively, but they also became sources of trauma for communities that had lived through the experiences being recounted. The balance between preserving valuable survival knowledge and protecting community mental health required careful attention to how and when these stories were shared. Economic and social planning was permanently influenced by winter survival experiences. Communities that had survived resource shortages developed more sophisticated storage and distribution systems. They created redundancies and safety margins that seemed excessive during good years, but proved essential during subsequent difficult periods. The institutional memory of survival techniques became embedded in community practices that persisted for generations. The reputation of communities and individuals was established largely by their performance during the most challenging winters. Stories of generosity, leadership, courage, and wisdom during survival crises became the foundation for long-term social standing and political influence. Conversely, failures of leadership or acts of selfishness during desperate times created reputations that could affect families for generations. But perhaps most importantly, winter survivors developed a unique appreciation for life that was both profound and practical. Having faced the realistic possibility of death, They understood the value of every additional day in ways that people who had never faced genuine mortality threats could not comprehend. This appreciation often translated into a determination to make the most of survival opportunities and to live with intensity that honored those who hadn't been as fortunate. The ghost of winter past didn't just haunt individuals, it shaped the entire culture's understanding of resilience, community, and the human capacity for both cruelty and compassion under extreme pressure. Here's something that might shock your modern sensibilities. When survival is at stake, democracy becomes a luxury that communities literally cannot afford. Viking winter settlements developed political systems that were ruthlessly efficient at making life or death decisions quickly. But these systems would make modern civil rights advocates break out in stress rashes. Welcome to survival politics, where voting is replaced by expertise, consensus is secondary to speed, and individual rights are balanced against collective survival in ways that would seem heartless if they weren't literally matters of life and death. Leadership during winter survival operated under completely different principles than peacetime governance. The people who made decisions weren't necessarily the ones who had been elected or inherited authority. They were the ones who had demonstrated competence at keeping people alive under impossible circumstances. A young person who had proven skilled at fire management might have more decision-making authority than an elderly leader whose peacetime wisdom was irrelevant to winter survival challenges. Resource allocation decisions required a level of brutal pragmatism that would be considered unethical in any other context. Leaders had to decide who received how much food, fuel, and shelter based on calculations that balanced individual need against community survival chances. These decisions were often made without consultation or consensus, because taking time for democratic processes could literally result in people dying while the community debated. The phrase, "we don't have time for fairness," wasn't political rhetoric, it was mathematical reality. The role of traditional social hierarchies became complex and sometimes contradictory during survival situations. Noble birth or wealth meant nothing if you couldn't contribute to essential survival tasks, but completely abandoning established social structures could create chaos that threatened everyone. Communities had to find ways to maintain enough social order to function effectively while adapting to survival realities that made traditional hierarchies irrelevant or counterproductive. Decision-making speed became more important than decision-making perfection, because delays could be fatal even when the decisions being made were suboptimal. Leaders learned to make quick judgments based on incomplete information, knowing that a mediocre decision implemented immediately was better than a perfect decision that came too late. This created leadership styles that prioritized action over deliberation and results over process. The collective versus individual rights debate took on stark reality during winter survival. Individual desires for extra food, warmer sleeping spots, or lighter work assignments had to be balanced against community needs for fair resource distribution and shared labor. People had to surrender personal autonomy in ways that would be intolerable during normal times, accepting restrictions on their choices because individual freedom could compromise collective survival. Information control became a critical leadership tool that balanced transparency against panic management. Leaders had to decide what information to share about food stores, fuel supplies, and survival projections. Too much honesty could create despair and social breakdown, but too little could prevent people from making necessary adjustments to their behavior and expectations. The balance between informed consent and protective deception required political skills that had nothing to do with traditional governance. Labor organization required systems that maximized essential work while maintaining social cohesion among people who were stressed, hungry, and confined together for months. Work assignments had to balance individual capabilities with community needs, gender roles with survival necessities, and traditional expectations with practical requirements. Someone had to decide who did which jobs, how work was distributed fairly, and how to handle people who couldn't or wouldn't contribute adequately. Conflict resolution took on life or death importance when interpersonal disputes could destroy the cooperation needed for community survival. Leaders had to develop systems for managing arguments, personality conflicts, and resource disputes quickly and effectively. Traditional legal systems were often too slow and complex for survival situations, requiring improvised justice systems that could maintain order without consuming excessive time and energy. The punishment system had to balance justice against community survival needs. People who stole food, refused to work, or otherwise threatened community welfare couldn't be banished or imprisoned because the community needed every person's labor. and couldn't afford to maintain non-productive members. Punishments had to be swift, effective, and designed to modify behavior rather than simply provide retribution. Sometimes this meant penalties that seemed harsh by modern standards, but were necessary for collective survival. Alliance building with other communities required diplomatic skills that balanced cooperation against competition for limited resources. Leaders had to decide which neighboring settlements to maintain relationships with, how much information to share about their own community's condition, and when to offer or request assistance. These relationships could provide crucial support during emergencies, but they also created obligations that might compromise their own community's survival chances. The communication systems within communities had to balance efficiency with inclusivity. Everyone needed to understand survival policies and expectations, but time spent on explanation and discussion was time taken away from essential survival tasks. Leaders had to develop communication methods that ensured compliance and understanding while minimizing the resources devoted to administrative functions. Gender roles were often suspended or modified during survival situations in ways that challenged traditional social structures but improved survival chances. Women might take on traditionally male roles if they had relevant skills. Men might handle traditionally female tasks if circumstances required it, and children might be assigned responsibilities normally reserved for adults. These role changes created social tensions, but also revealed capabilities and created precedents that affected post-winter social structures. The treatment of vulnerable community members, children, elderly, disabled, and sick people, required policies that balanced compassion against resource limitations. Communities had to develop systems for caring for people who couldn't contribute to survival efforts without compromising the welfare of those who were providing essential labor. These policies often involved difficult choices that seemed heartless but were mathematically necessary for community survival. Emergency protocols had to be established and practiced for situations like fires, structural collapses, severe weather, and attacks from other communities or wildlife. These protocols required clear chains of command and predetermined responses that could be implemented quickly during crises. The time for democratic deliberation about emergency responses was before emergencies occurred, not during them when every minute could determine who lived and died. Yet, despite the authoritarian nature of survival politics, successful Viking communities found ways to maintain human dignity and preserve social bonds that would be essential for rebuilding when winter ended. The political systems they developed weren't just about surviving winter, they were about surviving winter with enough social cohesion intact to create thriving communities when conditions improved. The question that haunted every winter settlement was whether their survival politics would prepare them for the ultimate test, emerging from winter with both their lives and their humanity intact. Imagine living for months in a world where hope is a dangerous luxury you can't afford, and then slowly, almost imperceptibly, noticing signs that hell might actually have an expiration date. The transition from winter survival to spring preparation wasn't a dramatic moment of relief. It was a gradual, nerve-wracking process of cautious optimism mixed with the terrifying awareness that premature hope could still kill you if you miscalculated the timing. The first signs of spring weren't the cheerful robins and blooming flowers of modern imagination. They were subtle changes that required experienced eyes to recognize and careful judgment to interpret. The angle of sunlight might shift slightly, creating shadows that fell differently across the longhouse floor. The wind might change direction or intensity in ways that suggested shifting weather patterns. Ice formations might develop characteristics that indicated temperature fluctuations. These signs were precious information, but they were also potentially misleading false promises that could lead to fatal overconfidence. The decision about when to begin spring preparations was perhaps the most critical judgment call of the entire winter experience. Start too early, and you might consume resources that would be needed if winter lasted longer than expected. Start too late, and you might find yourself unprepared when spring conditions actually arrived, and opportunities for renewal became available. This timing decision required balancing optimism against caution in ways that could determine whether the community thrived or barely survived into the growing season. Food rationing calculations became even more complex, as communities tried to estimate how long their remaining stores needed to last. Should they continue strict rationing to preserve resources for potential emergency needs, or could they afford to increase rations slightly to help people regain strength needed for spring work? The physical and psychological benefits of better nutrition had to be weighed against the risks of exhausting food supplies before reliable spring foraging became possible. Equipment preparation required communities to shift attention and resources toward tools and materials that would be needed for spring activities while still maintaining winter survival capabilities. Farming tools needed to be repaired or created, fishing equipment had to be prepared, and construction materials had to be organized for building repairs and improvements. But dedicating time and resources to spring preparation meant reducing the attention given to ongoing winter survival needs. The psychological transition was perhaps more challenging than the practical preparations. People who had spent months focusing on immediate survival had to begin thinking about future possibilities without abandoning the caution that had kept them alive. Hope had to be carefully managed enough to provide motivation for spring planning, but not so much that it led to careless decisions that could still prove fatal. The mental shift from survival mode to growth mode required emotional skills that had been suppressed during the darkest winter months. Physical recovery planning became essential as people began to consider what would be required to rebuild their strength and health for the demanding work of spring and summer. Months of malnutrition, limited exercise, and chronic stress had left everyone in compromised physical condition that would need careful rehabilitation. The transition from subsistence eating to nutritious meals had to be managed carefully to avoid digestive problems and ensure that recovered health supported rather than complicated spring work requirements. Community relationships that had been strained or damaged during winter survival needed attention and repair as people prepared to work together on spring projects. Grudges and resentments that had developed during resource allocation disputes had to be addressed before they affected cooperative efforts needed for planting, building, and other community activities. The forgiveness and reconciliation processes were essential for restoring the social cohesion needed for successful community rebuilding. The planning for spring activities required communities to shift from survival thinking to growth thinking, while maintaining the risk management skills that had enabled winter survival. Decisions about what crops to plant, which buildings to repair, and how to allocate labor had to balance optimistic assumptions about future prosperity against realistic assessments of available resources and capabilities. Overambitious spring plans could exhaust communities that were still recovering from winter privations. Seed management was a critical transition activity that required careful calculation and strict resource protection. Seeds that had been preserved through winter were precious resources that represented the foundation for food security in coming years. The decision about how many seeds to plant versus how many to preserve for future years required balancing current needs against long-term security. Losing seed stock could create food security problems that would affect multiple future growing seasons. The gradual resumption of normal social activities provided psychological benefits but also created new stresses as people readjusted to social interactions beyond basic survival cooperation. Celebrations, storytelling, games, and other cultural activities helped restore community morale and cultural identity, but they also required energy and resources that were still limited. The balance between psychological restoration and practical preparation required careful community judgment. Preparation for renewed contact with other communities involved both exciting opportunities and serious risks. Spring would bring chances for trade, social interaction, and cultural exchange that had been impossible during winter isolation, but it would also require communities to present themselves to outsiders, who would judge their success or failure based on their apparent condition and capabilities. First impressions with trading partners or potential allies could affect relationships for years to come. The anticipation of spring raiding season created mixed feelings of excitement and anxiety as communities prepared to resume the military and economic activities that had been suspended during winter. Young warriors who had survived their first brutal winter would be eager to prove themselves in battle, but they would also need to rebuild physical strength and skills that had deteriorated during months of limited activity. The community had to balance support for individual aspirations against collective needs for security and stability. Women's roles in spring preparation were particularly complex, as they prepared to resume responsibilities for food production, textile work, and household management, while also recovering from the physical and emotional stresses of winter survival. The transition from survival-focused labor to productivity-focused work required skills and energy that needed careful rebuilding. Their success in spring preparation would largely determine the community's prosperity during the coming year. The children's adaptation to spring possibilities required special attention, as adults helped them transition from the survival-focused mindset that had been necessary during winter to the curiosity and energy that would be needed for learning and growth during warmer months. Children who had learned to suppress their needs and desires for community survival had to be gradually encouraged to resume normal childhood development without losing the resilience and cooperation skills they had developed. But for all the anticipation and preparation, the arrival of spring would bring its own challenges and reveal whether the community had truly survived winter or merely postponed their reckoning with the costs of survival. You know what's worse than surviving the most brutal winter of your life? Discovering that emerging from that winter means confronting the disgusting, depressing reality of what months of survival living have done to everything you once considered clean, organized, or remotely civilized. Viking spring cleaning wasn't about decluttering or refreshing decor. It was about removing literal layers of filth, death, and despair that had accumulated during months of focusing on staying alive, rather than maintaining any semblance of sanitation or dignity. The smell was the first assault on returning consciousness, as warmer weather allowed people to truly appreciate the aromatic masterpiece they had been creating all winter. Months of unwashed bodies, animal waste, food decay, smoke residue, and various bodily functions had combined to create an olfactory experience that would make a medieval cesspit seem fragrant. Opening doors and windows for the first time in months wasn't refreshing. It was a brutal reminder of how far human standards had fallen in service of mere survival. The floors of longhouses had become archaeological sites, documenting every meal, every spilled liquid, every bodily function, and every piece of debris that had accumulated during winter. What had started as packed earth covered with rushes had become layers of organic matter that told the story of winter survival in ways that would make modern forensic investigators both fascinated and nauseated. Cleaning these floors wasn't sweeping. It was excavation that required tools and techniques more suited to construction than housekeeping. The sleeping areas presented their own special category of horror that combined months of unwashed human occupation with whatever various creatures had decided to make their homes in the warmth and darkness of bedding materials. Furs and fabrics that had been precious resources during winter had become ecosystems supporting populations of fleas, lice, mites, and other creatures that had found human warmth and blood an ideal environment for reproduction and community building. Food storage areas required careful archaeological investigation to determine what might still be edible versus what needed to be removed as potential biological hazards. Containers that had held preserved foods now contained substances that defied easy categorization. Were they still food? Had they become compost? Or had they achieved some intermediate state that represented new forms of life? The decision-making process for each container required skills that combined cooking knowledge, medical understanding, and pure courage. The fire pit and surrounding areas had accumulated months of ash, partially burned materials, food scraps, and various other substances that had been thrown into fires for disposal during winter. Cleaning these areas meant removing layers of material that documented every meal, every piece of fuel, and every desperate decision to burn something unusual when conventional fuel ran low. The archaeology of the fire pit told stories of rationing, desperation, and creative problem-solving that were both inspiring and depressing. Personal hygiene restoration was a gradual process that required more courage than vanity. Months without proper bathing had created conditions that made cleaning a medical necessity rather than a cosmetic preference. Hair had become matted masses that might require cutting rather than washing. Skin had developed layers of grime, oil, and various substances that had provided insulation during winter, that now represented health hazards that needed careful removal. Fingernails had become tools for survival activities, and now documented months of work in ways that would require serious intervention to restore. Clothing assessment revealed the true cost of winter survival on material possessions that had been essential for warmth and protection. Garments that had been valuable resources were now collections of holes, stains, and structural damage that had accumulated from months of continuous wear under harsh conditions. The decision about what could be repaired versus what needed to be discarded required balancing sentiment against practicality in ways that revealed how desperately precious every piece of fabric had become. The livestock areas presented challenges that combined animal husbandry with hazardous waste management. Animals that had survived winter had done so in conditions that prioritized warmth over cleanliness. creating living situations that would violate every modern animal welfare standard. Cleaning these areas required removing months of accumulated waste, while also caring for animals that were as malnourished and stressed as their human companions had been. Tool and equipment restoration revealed the true impact of winter survival activities on the materials and implements that had made continued existence possible. Metal tools had developed rust and damage from exposure to moisture and constant use. Wooden implements had warped, cracked, or suffered structural damage from temperature fluctuations and desperate emergency uses. Leather goods had hardened, cracked, or developed various forms of deterioration that affected their functionality for spring and summer activities. The water supply systems required complete overhaul after months of limited maintenance and emergency adaptations. Wells, cisterns, and other water sources had been modified or neglected during winter in ways that prioritized immediate access over long-term water quality. Spring cleaning meant not just removing visible contamination, but also restoring systems that could provide clean, safe water for increased spring and summer activities. Community spaces that had been shared during winter needed restoration that addressed both physical cleaning and social healing. Areas where conflicts had occurred, where difficult decisions had been made, or where community members had died, needed to be cleaned and rededicated in ways that honored what had happened while preparing for renewed community life. The psychological aspect of space cleaning was as important as the physical restoration. The disposal of waste and unusable materials created logistical challenges that required community cooperation and environmental awareness. Months of accumulated debris couldn't simply be dumped randomly without creating health hazards or environmental problems that would affect the community's long-term welfare. Waste disposal had to be organized and managed in ways that protected water sources, prevented disease transmission, and avoided attracting unwanted wildlife or pests. The gradual restoration of privacy and personal space was perhaps the most psychologically important aspect of spring cleaning. Months of communal living had created intimacies and tensions that needed to be addressed as people reclaimed individual identities and personal boundaries. Physical cleaning created opportunities for emotional restoration as people rebuilt their sense of personal dignity and individual identity after months of collective survival focus. But perhaps most importantly, spring cleaning represented the psychological transition from survival mode to living mode. The process of restoring cleanliness, order, and beauty to their environment was communities' way of reclaiming their humanity and preparing to create lives worth living, rather than simply enduring existences focused on not dying. The success of spring cleaning efforts would determine not just physical comfort, but the psychological foundation for rebuilding community life and preparing for whatever challenges the coming year might bring. So what do you learn when you've spent months balancing on the knife's edge between life and death, watching some of your closest companions succumb to cold, hunger, and despair, while somehow managing to drag yourself and others across the finish line of spring? The lessons Vikings extracted from winter survival weren't feel-good motivational quotes. They were brutal truths about human nature, resource management, and the thin line that separates civilization from chaos. The first and perhaps most important lesson was that individual survival and community survival were not the same thing, and the tension between them could destroy both, if not carefully managed. People who focused exclusively on their own welfare often compromised the cooperation needed for community survival, but people who sacrificed too much for others sometimes weakened themselves beyond their ability to contribute effectively. The optimal survival strategy required a sophisticated understanding of when to be selfish and when to be generous, a calculation that changed daily based on circumstances and resources. Resource management lessons went far beyond simple rationing to encompass complex systems thinking about consumption, storage, conservation, and waste reduction. Vikings learned that having resources and being able to use them effectively were completely different challenges. Food that spoiled due to poor storage was as useless as no food at all. Fuel that was burned inefficiently provided less warmth while consuming more materials. Tools that were poorly maintained became liabilities that increased rather than decreased survival challenges. Effective resource management required skills that combined technical knowledge with psychological understanding of human behavior under stress. Leadership during crisis situations required competencies that had nothing to do with traditional authority structures or peacetime management skills. Effective winter leaders were people who could make quick decisions under pressure, communicate clearly during chaos, maintain morale while being realistic about challenges, and balance competing needs fairly while maintaining group cohesion. These leadership skills were often demonstrated by people who had no previous authority, while traditional leaders sometimes proved ineffective when theoretical knowledge didn't translate to practical crisis management. The relationship between physical and psychological resilience was more complex than simple toughness or mental strength. People's ability to survive extreme conditions depended on their capacity to maintain hope without unrealistic optimism, accept harsh realities without falling into despair, make difficult decisions without being paralyzed by guilt, and preserve human relationships while competing for limited resources. Psychological resilience wasn't an innate trait, it was a skill set that could be developed through experience and practice. Community cooperation required systems and protocols that balanced individual autonomy with collective needs in ways that preserved both personal dignity and group effectiveness. Successful winter settlements developed governance structures that could make quick decisions when necessary, while maintaining enough democratic input to preserve social cohesion. They created work distribution systems that matched tasks with capabilities while sharing both burdens and benefits fairly. They established conflict resolution procedures that could address disputes quickly without destroying relationships needed for ongoing cooperation. Risk assessment and management became sophisticated skills that balanced preparation against paranoia, caution against paralysis. Vikings learned to distinguish between risks that could be mitigated through preparation and those that required acceptance and adaptation. They developed systems for monitoring multiple potential threats simultaneously while maintaining focus on immediate survival needs. They learned when to take calculated risks for potential benefits and when to prioritize safety over opportunity. The value of redundancy and backup systems became clear through experiences with single points of failure that could destroy entire communities. Successful settlements maintained multiple sources for critical resources like food, fuel, and water. They cross-trained multiple people in essential skills so that losing one expert wouldn't cripple community capabilities. They developed alternative plans for common problems and emergency protocols for unusual challenges. Redundancy wasn't wasteful preparation, it was insurance against catastrophic failures. Social capital proved to be as important as material resources for survival outcomes. Communities with strong relationships, effective communication systems, and established cooperation patterns survived challenges that destroyed settlements with better material preparation, but weaker social bonds. Trust, reciprocity, and mutual support weren't luxuries during good times. They were survival necessities that determined whether communities could maintain the cooperation needed to overcome extreme challenges. The importance of preserving cultural knowledge and traditions became apparent when communities needed guidance for dealing with unprecedented challenges. Stories, customs, and practices that had seemed like entertainment or ceremony proved to contain practical wisdom about survival techniques, social organization, and psychological coping strategies. Cultural preservation wasn't nostalgic sentiment, it was practical preparation for unknown future challenges. Adaptation and flexibility were more valuable than rigid adherence to established plans or traditional approaches. Conditions changed unpredictably, requiring communities to modify their strategies, adjust their priorities, and sometimes completely abandon their original preparations in favor of creative responses to unexpected challenges. The ability to change course quickly without losing focus on essential objectives was often the difference between survival and disaster. The relationship between individual dignity and collective survival required delicate balance that preserved human values while acknowledging practical necessities. Communities that maintained respect for individual worth and cultural values even during the most challenging circumstances emerged from winter with stronger social cohesion and better long-term prospects. Those that abandoned human values in favor of pure survival calculations often found that they had preserved lives but destroyed the communities that made those lives worth living. Quality of survival preparation mattered more than quantity of resources. Communities that understood their challenges thoroughly and prepared specifically for realistic scenarios often outperformed those with more resources, but less focused preparation. Effective preparation required accurate assessment of likely challenges, realistic evaluation of available capabilities, and specific planning for identified needs rather than generic accumulation of supplies. The long-term effects of survival experiences shaped community culture and individual behavior for generations. Communities developed institutional knowledge about crisis management, resource allocation, and social cooperation that improved their resilience for future challenges. Individuals acquired skills, perspectives, and relationships that affected their approach to risk, cooperation, and leadership throughout their lives. The lessons learned during survival challenges became cultural wisdom that prepared future generations for their own difficult circumstances. But perhaps the most important lesson was that survival wasn't just about staying alive. It was about preserving enough of what made life meaningful to rebuild something worth living for when the crisis ended. The communities that truly succeeded didn't just emerge from winter with breathing bodies. They emerged with intact relationships, preserved values, and restored hope that enabled them to create thriving societies during the recovery period. These lessons, written in ice and blood, became the foundation for a culture that would produce some of history's most successful explorers, warriors, and settlers. Here's the thing about surviving something that should have killed you. The relief of emerging alive doesn't erase the cost you paid to achieve that survival. Viking communities that successfully weathered brutal winters discovered that spring brought its own reckoning, a complex accounting of what had been lost, what had been gained, and what had been forever changed by months of living on the edge of human endurance. The physical toll was immediately visible in ways that couldn't be hidden or minimized. People who had entered winter healthy emerged gaunt, weakened, and marked by months of malnutrition and stress. Children had stopped growing or had developed the hollow-eyed appearance of chronic hunger. Adults showed the effects of sustained cold exposure, joint problems, respiratory issues, and skin damage that would affect them for years or permanently. The elderly who survived often emerged fundamentally changed, having lost weight, strength, and sometimes cognitive function that would never fully return. The demographic changes were stark and permanent in ways that affected community composition and capabilities for years to come. Some families had lost members, children who couldn't survive the harsh conditions, elderly relatives who hadn't had the strength to endure months of privation, or adults who had succumbed to illness, accidents, or the accumulated stress of survival. These losses weren't just personal tragedies, they were community capacity reductions that affected everything from available labor to preserved knowledge and social relationships. The economic impact extended far beyond the consumption of winter stores to encompass the destruction and degradation of tools, equipment, buildings, and other resources that had been sacrificed for immediate survival needs. Items that had been burned for fuel, consumed for food, or damaged through emergency use represented economic losses that would require significant investment to replace. Communities emerged from winter poorer in material terms, even when they had successfully preserved human life. The psychological trauma was perhaps more complex and long-lasting than the physical damage. People carried memories of desperate decisions, moral compromises, and witnessed suffering that would affect their mental health and social relationships for years. Children who had experienced severe hunger, cold, and fear developed anxiety and trust issues that influenced their entire approach to life. Adults struggled with guilt over survival choices, grief over losses, and fear about future winters that made normal social and economic activities more difficult. Social relationships had been fundamentally altered by the shared experience of survival, creating new bonds while destroying others. Families who had supported each other through crisis often emerged closer and more cooperative, but relationships strained by competition for resources, disagreements over survival decisions, or resentment over perceived unfairness sometimes never recovered. The social fabric of communities was rewoven by winter experiences in ways that created new patterns of cooperation and conflict. The distribution of survival burdens and benefits had created new social hierarchies and altered traditional power structures in ways that affected community governance and resource allocation for years to come. People who had demonstrated leadership, generosity, or essential skills during winter found their social status elevated. Those who had proved unreliable, selfish, or ornate found their influence diminished. The meritocracy created by survival challenges sometimes conflicted with traditional authority structures, creating ongoing political tensions. The women's experiences during winter survival often had particular long-term consequences that affected both individual lives and community demographics. Women who had been pregnant or nursing during winter faced health complications that affected their future reproductive capacity. Those who had miscarried or lost children to winter conditions carried trauma that influenced their willingness or ability to have additional children. The physical stress of winter survival sometimes created fertility problems that reduced birth rates for years after the survival experience. The children's development had been affected in ways that would influence their entire lives and the community's long-term prospects. Education and skill development had been suspended during survival focus, leaving children behind in learning that would affect their adult capabilities. The trauma and stress of survival experiences had created emotional and behavioral patterns that would require years to address. But these children had also developed resilience, cooperation skills, and practical knowledge that would serve them well in future challenges. The community's relationship with their environment had been changed by winter experiences in ways that affected their approach to land use, resource management, and seasonal preparation. Areas that had been over-harvested for fuel or emergency food might require years to recover. Wildlife populations that had been hunted more intensively might be reduced in ways that affected future hunting success. The environmental impact of survival activities sometimes created resource scarcity that extended beyond the immediate winter. The reputation of communities was established or modified by their winter survival performance in ways that affected their relationships with neighboring settlements and their attractiveness for trade, alliance, and settlement opportunities. Communities that had successfully weathered harsh winters developed reputations for resilience and effective leadership that brought opportunities and resources. Those that had struggled or failed faced diminished status that could affect their access to support during future challenges. The cultural impact was profound, as survival experiences became part of the community's identity and storytelling tradition. The stories that emerged from winter survival became cautionary tales, inspirational narratives, and practical guides that influenced community culture for generations. The heroes and villains identified during survival challenges became cultural archetypes that shaped community values and expectations. The technological and practical knowledge gained through survival experiences often led to innovations and improvements in preparation, resource management, and community organization that made future survival more likely and less costly. Communities learned from their mistakes and successes, developing better systems for food storage, fuel management, building construction, and social organization. These improvements represented one of the few clear benefits of survival experiences. The planning for future winters was forever changed by the reality of what survival actually required versus what had been assumed or hoped. Communities that had survived began preparing earlier, storing more resources, and developing more sophisticated systems for managing winter challenges. The theoretical became practical, and the optimistic became realistic in ways that improved long-term survival prospects. But perhaps the most significant cost was the loss of innocence about human vulnerability and the fragility of civilization. Communities that survived brutal winters understood in visceral ways that comfort, security, and prosperity were temporary conditions that could disappear without warning. This knowledge created both wisdom and anxiety that influenced every aspect of community life and individual decision-making. The price of spring wasn't just what had been lost during winter, it was the permanent change in how survivors understood life, death, community, and the delicate balance that separated thriving from mere survival. And here we are, 1,000 years later, sitting in our heated homes, complaining about Wi-Fi speed, while ordering food delivery to avoid the mild inconvenience of going to a grocery store that's stocked with more variety than Viking kings could have imagined. It's almost laughable, except that the echoes of those brutal winter settlements still reverberate through human culture in ways we rarely recognize or acknowledge. The modern obsession with preparedness, from doomsday preppers to emergency supply recommendations from government agencies, is a direct descendant of Viking winter planning, just with better technology and less immediate existential threat. We still calculate resource needs, storage requirements, and backup systems, because somewhere deep in our cultural DNA, we remember what happens when preparation meets harsh reality. The difference is that our survival challenges usually involve power outages and supply chain disruptions, rather than choosing which family member gets the last bit of food. The psychological patterns that enabled Viking winter survival continue to manifest in modern crisis situations, from natural disasters to economic collapses to global pandemics. The same human tendencies toward cooperation versus competition, individual versus collective needs, and hope versus despair play out in contemporary contexts. The communities that thrive during modern crises often demonstrate the same characteristics that enabled Viking settlements to survive: effective leadership, fair resource distribution, maintained social cohesion, and balanced individual autonomy with collective responsibility. Our modern safety nets, social services, insurance systems, Emergency response infrastructure and medical care represent institutional responses to the vulnerabilities that Viking communities faced individually. We socialized the risks that they had to manage personally, creating systems designed to prevent the kind of desperate survival calculations that defined their winter experiences. Yet these systems are still vulnerable to the same kinds of cascading failures that could destroy Viking settlements when multiple challenges aligned. The leadership lessons from Viking winter survival remain relevant in context ranging from corporate management during economic downturns to political leadership during national crises. The skills needed to guide groups through resource scarcity, maintain morale during uncertainty, make difficult decisions under pressure, and balance competing needs fairly are the same, whether you're managing a medieval longhouse or a modern organization. The technological tools have changed, but the human dynamics remain remarkably consistent. The relationship between physical and psychological resilience that Vikings understood intuitively has become the subject of extensive modern research in fields like psychology, neuroscience, and public health. Their practical knowledge about stress management, community support, and mental health during crisis situations has been validated and expanded by contemporary science. The coping mechanisms they developed, storytelling for psychological processing, community rituals for social bonding, and shared labor for maintaining purpose, are now recognized as evidence-based approaches to crisis management. Modern urban planning and architecture still reflect lessons learned from the kind of environmental challenges that Viking settlements faced daily. Building codes that require insulation and heating systems, urban design that considers weather and emergency access, and infrastructure planning that includes redundancy and backup systems all represent institutional memory of what happens when human settlements aren't properly adapted to environmental challenges. We've systematized the survival knowledge that Vikings had to discover through trial and error, the resource management principles that Vikings developed for winter survival, appear in contemporary contexts ranging from supply chain management to environmental conservation to household budgeting. The understanding that consumption must be balanced against storage, that waste reduction is essential during scarcity, and that resource allocation decisions affect both immediate welfare and long-term sustainability remains relevant across scales, from individual families to global resource management. The social cooperation mechanisms that enabled Viking communities to survive continue to emerge during modern crisis situations, from neighborhood responses to natural disasters to international cooperation during global challenges. The balance between individual needs and collective welfare, the importance of fair resource distribution for maintaining cooperation, and the role of leadership in maintaining group cohesion are constants in human social organization, regardless of technological context. Yet there's something we've lost in our transition from immediate vulnerability to systematized security. Vikings understood viscerally that survival was never guaranteed, that cooperation was essential, and that individual welfare was inseparable from community welfare. Modern humans often live with the illusion that security is permanent, and individual success can be achieved independently of social support systems. This disconnect from survival realities sometimes leaves us unprepared for the kind of challenges that Vikings faced routinely. The climate change challenges facing modern civilization echo the environmental unpredictability that Viking communities navigated without technological support. Rising sea levels, extreme weather events, resource scarcity, and environmental migration create challenges that require the same kind of adaptive capacity, community cooperation, and resilience that enabled Viking winter survival. The scale is global rather than local, but the human response is needed: effective leadership, fair resource allocation, maintained social cohesion, and balanced individual and collective needs remain remarkably similar. The lessons about human nature that Vikings learned through winter survival remain uncomfortably relevant. They discovered that people could be capable of both remarkable generosity and shocking selfishness, that leadership quality was revealed through crisis rather than comfort, that social cooperation required active maintenance and couldn't be taken for granted, and that individual survival was meaningless without community survival. These insights about human behavior under stress apply to contemporary challenges, ranging from economic inequality to political polarization to global resource management. The cultural memory of survival challenges continues to influence modern Scandinavian societies in ways that are visible in their approaches to social policy, environmental management, and international cooperation. The emphasis on social safety nets, environmental sustainability, and cooperative governance reflects institutional memory of what happens when communities fail to manage resources fairly or prepare adequately for challenges. The lessons learned through centuries of harsh winters became cultural values that persist in modern policy preferences. But perhaps the most important echo of Viking winter settlements is the reminder that human civilization is more fragile and temporary than we usually acknowledge. Their experiences demonstrate that even well-prepared, capable communities can face challenges that test the limits of human endurance and social cooperation. They also demonstrate that humans are capable of extraordinary resilience, adaptation, and cooperation when survival depends on it. The thousand-year perspective reveals both how much has changed and how little has changed in the fundamental challenges of human survival and community cooperation. We have better tools, more systematic preparation, and greater understanding of the natural forces we face, but we still face the same basic challenges of resource management, social cooperation, and adaptation to environmental changes that defined Viking winter survival. Their legacy isn't just in the stories and artifacts they left behind, but in the demonstration that humans can survive almost anything if they're willing to cooperate, adapt, and accept that survival sometimes requires sacrifices that are difficult to make, but necessary to preserve what matters most. Let that sink in as you consider what lessons their frozen struggles might offer for whatever winters, literal or metaphorical, you might face in your own life. Thanks for joining me on this journey through humanity's most brutal survival story. If this made you appreciate your thermostat in grocery stores a little more, you know what to do. Sweet dreams, and remember, your worst Monday is still better than Bjorn's best Tuesday.